turn your Bibles to the book of Exodus again. We're continuing our study through the Ten Commandments. And so if you turn to Exodus chapter 20, today we're in verse 15. And we're on the 8th commandment out of 10 that we've been going through. And hopefully we're learning some things, not only about what commandments were designed to do, but most importantly, how do they apply to us today in what we do and how we live. And so it's interesting because different people look at the commandments and we try to break them down into subsets and groups. And many would say the first 4 commandments are really about our relationship with God. That's about honoring His name, honoring the Sabbath, about no idols, putting no graven images, all those sort of things that really are reflective of understanding who God is. But then the last 6 commandments are really about our relationship with other people, how that applies to the people we encounter in many different settings. And somebody I was reading this week said, it may be a way of looking at the last 6 commandments are really about our attitudes towards certain things. For instance, we looked at thou shalt not murder. We know that's what is our attitude towards life. Really, what a living person is and what that means. And when it says, thou shalt not commit adultery, really, what is our attitude towards the family and marriage and those sort of institutions that are part of our culture. And so, today as we look at this commandment, you shall not steal, what is really our attitude towards not just stealing, not just theft, but quite honestly, what is your attitude towards possessions? Because that's really what it's about. Because, God wants us to really have an understanding of the fact that, what does it say? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it is His. So when it comes to possessions, it's kind of a funny word if you think about it, because we really don't possess anything. He owns it all. Although He's given us to be stewards of it, and that's where some of these principles we'll talk about apply. The Lord is sort of looking at what is our attitude towards possessions. Now, let's try to define some. I think always when we look at these terms, let's have a good working definition of what it means. So when we say, do not steal, you shall not steal, what is stealing? Somebody define stealing for me.
Taking something that doesn't belong to you.
Taking something that doesn't belong to you. It's pretty good. Say again?
Without permission.
Without permission. So you're taking something that doesn't belong to you, and they don't know you took something that is theirs. So there's permission involved there. Because sometimes somebody can give something to you, and because you receive that doesn't mean you've stolen it, but taking it without their permission. How else would you define stealing? Any other nuances to that? Yes. Say again? Sneaky. That's very good. Because sometimes stealing is very obvious. Sometimes, more often than not, it is sneaking something. Cleverly, so nobody knows. Yes. Okay. So, the idea of theft and stealing is it just about taking stuff? Taking stuff from somebody else? No. What do you mean? How else could it be not that?
It could be intellectual property or...
Intellectual property, interesting. Yes?
Stealing time.
Stealing time, very good.
The desire of wanting something that does not belong to you.
There's a certain desire there. Sort of goes over into coveting something, but it has a lot to do with what is motivating a person to want something else. Anything else as far as opposed to just possessions? We've mentioned time and intellectual property.
Like adultery.
Adultery,
desiring a woman
correct.
or a man, like in the Bible.
Right, exactly. That is not your possession. When you take that, you have stolen that person. That's exactly right.
Fulfilling our own greed.
Fulfilling our own greed, because many times the root of our stealing or taking something is rooted in greed, because we want more. It is never enough as far as when we look at that. Let me give you some statistics I thought were interesting just about stealing. And again, it's hard to break down because there's so many areas. You can look at larceny and grand larceny and a misdemeanor. We're unfortunately, our family has sort of gone through this in the last couple of weeks. I think I shared with you that at our house, somebody came on the property and took things that were ours without our permission. And so looking at what does that really mean by what they took and what is the value of that and why did they take it and all that stuff. And so, you know, I wish God wouldn't teach me some of these lessons in real time. I'd rather learn just something to think about that when I preach next time. That's not something I got to live through, or all of us do for that matter. So statistics in regard to, we know one common source of theft is shoplifting, right? And this is some data. They said the number of people who are shoplifters in the United States is 27 million. Isn't that scary? 27 million who are shoplifters, people who take something that is not theirs. Now, the number of people who are arrested in the last 5 years for shoplifting is only 10 million. So 10 million over 5 years, so maybe a couple million a year out of this grand number that are actually arrested for shoplifting. So the odds of getting caught shoplifting is 1 in 48 in the United States. Now, Carol can probably tell you what she has to endure at Walmart for the number of people that take things that is not theirs, simply walk out the door, what they're able or not able to do, simply because, you know, they have stolen something. And they're walking out the door, and how frustrating that is. Now, they said, that this is last year, the estimate of the amount of things that were stolen from retail, stores and things like that last year was $13 billion. United States. $13 billion last year, the things that people just took, or they stole, not what was brought back and like that. But then you can get into is sort of what we talked about before, besides just stuff, many other things are thought to be ways in which people are stealing. Some would say, if you look at the IRS estimated that there was $20 million in underreported taxes. That is also stealing. It gets worse, everybody, so don't worry. The estimated number of amount lost from people who take sick days dishonestly. The United States, dishonestly last year was $350 billion in lost wages and what was done by people who simply take sick days because they're not really sick. So, again, it gets worse. So, as we talk about what does it really mean to this command about you shall not steal, let's try, it's hard to categorize, but I'll put this into some categories to help us understand what it is. And I'll put it into 4 different areas about stealing. And there are those that are what would be considered basic theft. Basic theft is where I go over to Alan's backyard and I walk off with his lawnmower without his permission and I don't bring it back. That is very... Thank you. It is now a gift. It's not theft anymore. I take something from somebody that is simply not mine, blatantly, without any question, I just take it. That's basic theft. And so we know that the Bible talks a lot about this, and we'll talk about kind of the Old Testament view of theft versus the New Testament view of theft. But then more importantly, there are other things that you're just not allowed to steal. But people do it honestly. You mentioned intellectual property. What about those who go out and you maybe have some software, and you steal that software from somebody. You didn't pay for it. Somebody gives it to you. You use it. So you don't really consider it's really not stealing, but it quite honestly is, because you take something that was not yours without somebody's permission. You take it. It's still stealing. It's still wrong, and you're still told not to do it. Well, what's interesting about this commandment is it's a very, very straightforward, comprehensive commandment. He doesn't tell you, okay, don't steal from a certain person, or don't steal certain things, or don't steal in certain places, or don't steal for only certain reasons. It says, you shall not steal. It's comprehensive, which means don't steal anything from anybody, anytime, for any reason. Now, I would say that is a lot more difficult for us to understand in our culture today, because there's what we would consider gray areas. Take business, for example. If you're in business, you're trying to make a profit. So you do certain things to make that profit. Is that stealing from people?
No.
No? Is it never stealing from people? Well, this gets a little dicey because sometimes when you're taking advantage of people, making profit beyond what is reasonable, then that actually is stealing. So the idea of profit isn't necessarily wrong, but profit for selfish gain, wrong reasons could be wrong and could be considered sinful. All right? So we talked about basic theft. Then there's this category we call sophisticated stealing. Now, the sophisticated just means it's not so obvious. And I got to tell you something as a disclaimer. All the things that I'm going to mention today may not be the opinion of me, you, or God, or whatever. These are interpretations of what is considered stealing or not. But I would tell you one simple thing about how you already know as believers. If you're doing something and all of a sudden you question in your mind, I wonder if this is right or if this is stealing. There is a very good chance, I would say a very high percentage, almost certainly, that maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And so we want to look at some of those areas very specifically. So what would be some things that would be sophisticated stealing? Not so obvious. Yes.
How about stealing somebody's identity?
Stealing somebody's identity. Again, that's, you don't know that, you're doing that to benefit from them, and so that certainly would be very sophisticated in how people do that. What else?
Here, I had a neighbor when I lived in Florida. Lovely, lovely, lovely young woman. And she told me that the girls became friendly. She worked in one of these classic department stores. And what they did was they would take the clothes that they wanted, put it all the way underneath so that when it will go on sale, they could buy it.
So, a bit of trickery there involved in what they do to set it aside so it goes on sale, so they're benefiting that for personal reasons. I mean, obviously, look at it. The person who robs a bank is a thief. The person who works for the bank, who embezzles a little bit of money, is an embezzler, not a thief. Consider the person who steals something from a government facility is considered a thief. The senator who uses tax money wrong is said he's just misappropriating funds. We use different terms, but the reality is still the same thing. We're taking something that we've been given charge over to care for or to manage. It is not ours, and what we do with that very much can be considered stealing. So there are certainly those things that are sophisticated. There's what some people consider intangible stealing or thievery, which would be things like cheating, plagiarism. You know, if you are plagiarizing something and you say that it's your words and it's not your words, you have stolen somebody's ideas and used them for your own. Gossip. Ooh. Gossip is, what is gossip stealing?
Misuse of information.
Somebody's reputation. Misuse of somebody's good name. By gossiping about them and talking about them, even especially to other people, you have now discredited them in some way, and you have stolen some credibility from that person. Many times we're already alluded to in regard to work. You know, the idea of the American worker is to get paid as much as you can for doing as little as you can. But in reality, many times, that is simply stealing from your employer. Just because of what God says about work, and who are we doing these things unto? Our employer or somebody else?
The Lord.
There's also what some people consider spiritual theft. What would be some ideas of spiritual theft?
Misusing the power of God, but for your own gain.
Misusing the power of God, we're talking using His name in vain, or trying to use that power in a way that benefits us, not really for the good of perhaps what it was intended.
Yeah.
Adultery destroys families.
Adultery destroys families. And many times that steals all sorts of things, from a person's reputation, from another man's wife or husband or something like that. How else would there be spiritual robbery, if you will?
On television, and I heard this, I experienced it. They tell you if you send so much money, they will pray for you, and you will get what you want.
Exactly. Those who try to take advantage of people who, especially the poor, people don't have much, that if you send so much money, God is going to bless you, and if you don't, He will not. And so they take the money, and it has nothing to do with God blessing them. All right? Just simply the idea of gifts. Maybe God has gifted you with a talent or an ability, and if you are not using it for Him, you are stealing, if you will. You are not using that for the intended purpose, and you are stealing from God. And most importantly is in regard to tithes and offerings. Malachi 3 says, will you rob God? And they say, how do we rob God? And He says, in the tithes and offerings. And put me to the test. If you do this, I will pour out a blessing greater than you could ever imagine. Exactly.
But we're getting thrown into the same ditch.
Exactly. That's for sure. Now, as we think about these things now, just to have your mind about what sort of things could stealing be or theft be, we need to sort of identify who are the culprits, who are the ones who are guilty of this idea of stealing. Now, many times it's very obvious. We hear the stories about thieves who do some really ridiculous things. One I read very recently, a young man goes into a liquor store and he has a gun and he holds a gun to the clerk and he says, listen, I want you to give me all the money. And he says, okay, here's all the money. And before the guy leaves, he says, listen, I want that bottle of scotch. And the very clever clerk says, well, I can't do that. And he says, why? He says, because I think you're under 21. He says, well, that's not true. Here's my ID. And he takes the bottle of scotch, and the clerk calls the police and says, here's his name, here's his address, and or the guy who decides he's going to steal gasoline from the recreational vehicle because they have very large tanks and have a lot of gasoline. So he goes up where this RV is parked and he puts the tube in there to siphon out the gas, and all of a sudden he gets deathly ill, realizing he put that in the wrong tank. Yes. Very bad. Okay. While we're talking about this, I'm going to pass around a copy of a picture. I want you to take one copy and I want you to look at the picture. And tell me, we're going to talk about in this picture, and I'll give you some context about this. What is this picture about? Many of you know that the Saturday Evening Post has been around for many, many years and had wonderful depictions on the front of it of all sorts of things. And who was the most famous person who did these pictures of the Saturday Evening Post? Norman Rockwell, from out western Massachusetts, I believe, right? Stockbridge. So here's you're looking at a picture. Is this a Norman Rockwell?
No.
It is not a Norman Rockwell. I want to have one. It is not a Norman Rockwell. It's actually by somebody else who was an artist who also did a number of covers for the Saturday Evening Post. So if you look at this picture, tell me some things that you see in this picture that are of significance.
He's holding the weight up, and he's pushing it down.
Exactly. So who's the thief?
Oh,
They're both thieves. If you look at this picture, they're staring at the scale. But yet, one is pushing up on, the lady's pushing up on the bottom of the scales, and the guy's pushing down on the scales. And it pretty much sums up our lives as thieves ourselves. Because many times what makes us a thief is trying to get more than we really paid for, we deserve, or giving less than what we owe. Very simply, think about this. If we think of the context of stealing is many times being more about getting more than what we really deserve or we pay for, or actually on the other side of that, giving less than what we really owe to people, then both are stealing.
is the artist also stealing? Because the artist actually duplicated exactly how Norman Rockwell painted.
Someone asked that question because when you read some stories about this picture, they will say, that's a Norman Rockwell. But yet, the style that this person uses was exactly like Norman Rockwell's. Now, they give credit where credit is due, and Norman Rockwell even commented on this, saying, it's fine. I'm flattered by the fact that somebody else would want to paint like that. But the reality is, what it says, which way are we tipping the scales in our own lives? Because many times, stealing is not about just being poor, so you steal because you need more. As much stealing goes on about those who have more than enough as those who don't have enough. So if you look at the Old Testament, think about what are some things that are in the Old Testament that it says about stealing. Any things you've read in the Old Testament just about stealing? What happened when you steal something? Say again? You cut your hand off.
No, wasn't there restitution in the Bible? Was restitution not coming hand off?
Huge thing, and when you look at it, if you go to Exodus, actually in Exodus chapter 22, you go to Leviticus, I think it's 11, you read there's a lot of laws that were given in the Old Testament about your stuff. And it basically says, listen, if a guy steals your cow, and you're caught, and you've either sold that cow, or you've eaten that cow, and they find out that it's you, you need to make restitution, which means what? You need to give him a cow back, right? Not what the Bible says. You need to give him 5 back. If it's sheep, it's 4 back. That even the concept of restitution is not just giving back what you have taken, but perhaps giving back more than you have taken. Why would God do that?
Deterrent.
It's a deterrent to crime. Exactly. You don't have that many cows. Consequence. So he's saying that there's a price to be paid if you steal something. What else does the Old Testament say about stealing? Yes.
How many times does the cashier give you the wrong change, more than you should be getting? You know it and you don't say anything.
Yeah. You walk out and that extra dollar or that extra change, oh my goodness. They must have forgotten. Oh, we knew all along. That too was stealing, exactly. But what else does the Old Testament say about stealing? Anything else? I mean, it covers pretty much everything. If you kidnap somebody, if you take somebody, obviously there's a price to be paid, a hefty one, but you can't take somebody that is not your own, whether that is a spouse, whether that is a slave or something like that. There are rules that govern that you can't take people and you can't take things. That same idea of restitution, if you look, it's the chapter 21, 22 in Exodus, if you read through some of those laws, it talks about if somebody ruins your vineyard, they basically taken your stuff. They need to make restitution, even in their own vineyard, either pay it back in kind, plus some, or make it right over a period of time. And quite honestly, if you don't have the ability to pay it back, you have to then what? You become their slave. Now, I don't think we look at this idea about stealing in the same manner. We don't think, you think about it. We just went through this idea of talking with the police. If somebody steals something, they give the stuff back, don't worry about it. It's not going to go anywhere in the courts. Or somebody takes something and it's really not that important or was so small it doesn't matter, well, we don't even worry about that. Does God do it the same way? No. God does not like us to steal. And the reason, why do you think God puts this law, why do you think He puts this commandment here?
Because He's the provider.
He's the provider. And the whole thing about the context of what the Old Testament says about stealing is it's not about the stuff that somebody takes or loses. It's the fact that the statement you're making about God. If you are stealing something, it means that you simply don't trust God to provide. Broad statement means everything. If you steal something, or you take something, you're simply saying, I don't trust that God can give me what I need. I need to take it myself. Yes?
Wasn't there a story, I don't remember which one it was, that somebody changed babies what was the story?
Solomon.
That was true with Solomon, where a lady wanted to say that it was her baby and the one who was caring for that. And so they bring her and they say, what are we supposed to do? And Solomon says, cut the baby in half.
Right, oh, yeah.
We don't do that anymore. So that's good. So this idea, again, in the Old Testament about stealing is the fact that it really says, I don't trust God enough to provide. Now, if you think about that, how does that apply to modern day? It's everything. Because many times the reason that we are stealing time, that we are stealing talent, we are stealing stuff, the things we do, is simply because we don't trust God to provide it in another way. Yes.
I think, at least in this day and age, it seems that we also have a sense of entitlement. That we actually are owed this.
Correct.
And God doesn't see it that way.
He does not. If we are simply taking something because, hey, I'm so-and-so, I deserve this, or I'm owed this. And all of a sudden you put that in the context of how we behave ourselves. Let's take the workplace. So I say, listen, I work pretty hard. I deserve to take a longer lunch break because I work pretty hard. Or you know what? I deserve to not work so hard because the last hour I worked harder than I usually do. So it all balances out because that's what I am owed or what I deserve. Now, if God really gave us what we deserve,
We'd all be dead.
we'd all be dead. So it is a question of entitlement about what we think that we're owed. It is a question about trust that we really don't think that God, who we say He is, can really provide enough for us to live on to have everything we need. We've got to do something else. We need to take matters into our own hands. And so we do. And so this idea that He's saying, you shall not steal, is really trying to make a statement. Listen, don't do this because what you're saying is you don't trust me. You don't believe I am who I said I am, that I own everything, and I will give you exactly what you need when you need it at the right time. And as soon as you start stealing, all of a sudden, the statement you're making about God is bigger than what you're stealing. Now think about this. What do you think the New Testament says about stealing? What are some thoughts in the New Testament? Samantha?
Ananias and Sapphira.
Ananias and Sapphira, what happened to them? Tell the story briefly.
The people in the church were like giving all their money to the church, and then everybody was sharing everything. And they brought money, and they said, "This is all of our money from this land that we sold." But they kept some of it for themselves, and then God struck them with it.
Well, that doesn't happen too much anymore, right? If I said to all of you now, I want you to come up here, empty all of your wallets, your purses, put them in a pile here because we need to use them for something else. Would you do it? No. You would think, first of all, Dan's going crazy. You think, second of all, Dan's really going crazy. And third of all, God doesn't really need me to give all of what I have. He gave me some of this so I can take care of it. It's my stuff. I earned this money. I need this money because I got to pay my rent tomorrow. Or you know what? I have bills to pay. I wouldn't have to give all of that to God. But yet what he's saying is, the earth is mine and everything in it. What else does the New Testament say about stealing?
You have to confess it.
Have you confessed it? Stealing obviously is a sin. If you look at both the Apostle Paul and Peter, both of them use the terminology that thieves, swindlers, all of those kind of guys are basically will not inherit the kingdom of God. So they put people who steal in the same category as homosexuals, as fornicators, as swindlers, all of those things. Same category. You're just as debased as anybody else. You're just as great a sinner as somebody who is a murderer or something like that. So he's saying a pretty serious thing here. God takes this idea about stealing very seriously. It's sinful. What else does the New Testament say about stealing?
Let him who steals steal no longer and work with his own hands. He might have something to give back.
That's correct. Ephesians 4, I believe. So, stop stealing. This whole Bible thing's pretty simple. Old Testament says don't steal. New Testament says stop stealing. Very clear, yes, Amy?
It says man was given a choice to do what he wanted to do.
That's correct. And we make that choice every single day.
Many times a day.
Any time of day. Anywhere we are. Now, if you remember, as we've gone through some of these last commandments, Jesus sort of revisited them in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember, he says, you thought it says, thou shalt not murder. I say, listen, if you have anger in your heart, he goes on that whole thing we went through by murder, anger. He also talked about committing adultery. If you look on another woman with lust in your eyes, you've also committed adultery. So does he cover this idea about stealing anywhere in the Sermon on the Mount?
God knew their heart, and he was testing them all the time to
Constantly.
see where they belong.
That's right.
Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things that you need will be added to you.
Okay, seek first the kingdom of God. All these things added. So you can apply that principle certainly to stealing, if you will. What else does he say about, or does he say anything about stealing in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes?
Someone steals, isn't it give your coat? If someone's, give more to the robber?
Exactly. Somebody asks for your cloak, your coat, give your cloak also. Go the second mile. So is in regard to that. One other thing he talks about. Don't lay up for yourself what? Treasures. Where thieves may come and steal them, or moth and dust doth corrupt, but lay up yourself treasures in heaven, where thieves cannot steal, and moth and rust will not corrupt. And so this whole idea, what he's trying to drive home in the New Testament about stealing, is this whole principle about treasures and possessions, and where is your really heart in the midst of that? Because I think if you think about what are the things that we steal, or we take, usually are things that we treasure, or we cherish, or we simply want. And so if we think about that principle, that what he's trying to say is, you want to lay up yourself treasures, things that you're going to want or desire are the things that are going to matter for eternity, as opposed to today, it's very different. There's an example, a guy named Richard Foster, who wrote a great book called Celebration of Discipline, was talking about this idea about value and treasure. He said, imagine it like this. Say in the United States, we were given a warning that we're going to change our currency from the dollar to the British pound. But you're not going to know when it's going to change, but it will change at some point. And when it does change, the dollar will be worth absolutely nothing. So think about that. If the president or somebody came on and said, we've decided we're going to change our currency, it is the dollar now, we're going to change it to something else, but you don't know when it's going to change. But when it does, your dollar will mean nothing. If you apply that to how we live, it changes it all. Because all of a sudden, I don't want to be left with a whole bunch of dollars, because eventually it's going to mean something. I'm going to convert the majority of what I have to pounds that are going to be of value later on. So I'm only going to hold on to enough just to get by. And if we lived by that principle, oh, what a different world it would be. But yet we live in a world where it's about planning, it's about security, it's about all of those things that have to do with our stuff, our possessions. There's a guy named Ray Stedman who I was reading a sermon he was doing on this actual commandment, and he categorized stealing 5 kinds of thievery that we tend to overlook, and these are the most destructive. That taking possessions can all be replaced. But these areas of thievery are the most damaging, the ones we meet the most freedom of. Number 1, someone already mentioned, stealing time. Whether that's simply stealing time from your employer or what you're doing, or maybe it's simply just always being late. You're always late. You're stealing time because the problem with time, it's the one thing, once you've taken it, you can't give it back. You cannot replace it. I can't say I'm going to give you those 15 minutes back. I may try to find another 15 minutes to give you, but those 15 minutes from say 9 o'clock to 9:15, they are gone and gone forever. And if we are really stealing time from one another on many levels, it's thievery.
What about God's time?
What about God's time? Explain it.
Stealing God's time. God gave us these lives and all the blessings that we have for a purpose.
That's right.
Not to sit on them, not to just spend them on ourselves, but He gave us all that we have so that we would give that back to Him.
Just the same. God's given us everything. He doesn't ask a lot, but what are we willing to give? So they're stealing time, the time thief. The second one is the gossiping thief. We already talked about that. That as soon as you start talking about somebody, you are now taking away from their reputation many times in a way that you cannot get back ever again. Because maybe those people who heard it, maybe you won't see them. You won't have the opportunity to make that right because what you said was the wrong thing. Or maybe, quite honestly, by what you said in gossiping and where you've taken that person's reputation, you have now forever changed how somebody's going to think about that person. They're always going to say, oh, Dan's that kind of guy. Well, I never would have thought he would have done that. It will always come to mind because you now planted that and you've stolen some of his credibility, or more importantly, his witness. So there's the gossiping thief. There's the defrauding thief. Now, what do you think the defrauding thief might be?
I'm selling you a bowl that is actually an antique and it's worth $1 million.
Exactly. It's actually representing something. You're committing fraud. You're saying something is this that you're selling them, that you're benefiting from, that it is not. But even more subtly, the defrauding thief might be the person who is stealing somebody's purity. Think about that. Stealing somebody's purity. Taking something away from somebody when you don't have a right to do that. Or maybe you're simply using your influence to mislead somebody. You're defrauding them because you are now representing something that classically happens in alcohol. You know? Oh, come with me, have a drink, it won't hurt you. Come with me, have a few, it's no problem. And that person who is in some respect perhaps innocent, all of a sudden they're led into a lifestyle they just simply think is okay. Because your influence has been used to defraud them, to mislead them in some way. What about a term, what do you think a careless thief might be? A careless thief.
Drunk driver, killing somebody's daughter.
Simply drunk driver, something happening that they have taken something from somebody they had no idea because of their own selfish reasons, poor decision making, what they do, the careless thief.
Would that be like borrowing something and not returning it?
Exactly. Many times the careless thief is the person who borrows something and you never see it again. You know, a person who says, hey, where's your shovel? Well, check Alan's garage, I'm sure it's there. I loaned it to him 2 years ago and he still hasn't given it back. Or quite honestly, yeah, Alan had that kind of relationship. Or it may be somebody who, you know what, yeah, I'm going to pay you back for that. Or you go out, you know you owe somebody for something and you don't pay them back. You've stolen from them. It's just the same thing.
When you lend money to family, it happened to my husband and me, we loaned thousands. And the person had never, the person came to borrow and never again acknowledged us about the money up to this time.
Right. And many people do that. We think it's borrowing. They look at it very differently. They look at it as gifting or supplying or whatever it is. But all of that said together, all of these things have to do with what? Which has been the theme throughout all of these commandments. What is the real root of the problem, if you will?
Don't trust God.
Selfishness. And selfishness is typically rooted where? Not in your head, in your heart. That what you're trying to do is best for you, And so you do all these things in order to benefit yourself, and that's where your heart is.
How about if you call a friend of yours that you work with and tell him, I'm gonna be a little late this morning, would you punch me in when you punch yourself in?
Okay?
Who's the guilty one?
Both. Again, it's stealing time, all of those same things. So, obviously you can take, you can spend weeks and weeks and weeks talking about all these different areas about how we're stealing from one another in time and talents and carelessness and our consideration, all of those sort of things. And we're all guilty. We're all either pushing up on the scale or we're pushing down on the scale, as the picture shows. So what is the solution? Alan already alluded to it. Somebody turn your Bibles to the book of Ephesians chapter 4 and read verse 28. Ephesians 4:28.
He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need.
Exactly. This one verse gives you the 3 steps you need to get over your problem with being a thief. Very simple. What's the first step?
Stop stealing.
Stop stealing. Steal no longer. Simple remedy for those who are struggling with this, just stop stealing. But the way you stop stealing, you have to acknowledge, you have to see what you're doing is stealing. What's the second step? Work. Is that to make a restitution? Not necessarily. What else? Why does it say work?
Because if you don't work, you shouldn't eat.
If you don't work, you shouldn't eat. They talk about that later, because this idea, many people, what's rooted in their stealing is the simple fact that they think somebody owes them that. And all of a sudden, if you realize, I need to work for my wage or what I'm doing, it changes your attitude towards what you're doing. And what's the third thing it says to do?
Give back.
Give back. Now that's, the idea we talk about restitution, but many times if you find that you have a struggle with stealing time, the best way to remedy that is give time to somebody else. Not only honor that person's time, but then realize if I'm not giving time to Alan, I'm going to spend time with him as opposed to stealing time. I've seen the value of who he is. I've seen the value of time, and all of a sudden it matters differently. So very simple commandment, don't steal. Very simple remedy, stop stealing, go to work, and give back. Now, if you were to sum this up in one phrase, the whole thing in one phrase, I would say, actually it's 4 phrases. We steal because we do not have enough. If our idea, the reason why we steal is because we feel that we don't have enough, then that's a problem in your heart. Because if God is not enough, you will never have enough. Number 2, we steal because we desire what others have. If we think that other person, listen, they have a nice car, I should have a nice car. So I'm going to do what I need to do to get the money so I can have that nice car. But if you realize that we desire what others have, you don't know what others are going through. And so simply putting that in perspective will help your idea about stealing. We steal because we want what we have not earned. We already talked about that. Our mindset is get the most you can by doing as little as you can. And again, if you put that in a spiritual context, it simply means that if we got what we really deserve, we get a whole lot of nothing. And the last thing is, we steal because we fear the future. We fear that this God that we believe in is not going to supply all of our needs. He's not going to give us what we need, when we need it, where we need it, at the right time. And so we live in this idea of fear, and all of a sudden we're stealing all sorts of things in our mind and in our heart and with our hands. So you say, well, it's simple, Dan, just to say trust God, but you don't know the circumstances I'm in. You're right. I may not know the circumstances you're in. But I do know that if we trust God, His Word says He will supply all of our needs according to His riches and glory. Can a thief be saved?
Yes,
Yes. What's the greatest story about that?
on the cross.
On the cross. Jesus covered all of salvation, what it means, in one phrase. What did He say to the guy? You shall be with me in paradise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. That's correct. So his salvation was instantaneous. It was personal because He said you. It was certain because it says you will be with me in paradise. It says it was about relationship because you'll be with the Lord. It's about paradise forever. So stealing isn't the unpardonable sin. But there's only one way that sin is forgiven and you get fruit.